We're going to be talking about Japan in the next couple lectures, and so I wanted to start by saying something about the early foundations of Japanese religion. You can see on the screen that there are mountains and a field. This is very typical of Japanese geography. Japan is a set of volcanic islands, and people live primarily in the plains where they plant rice as their primary crop, and therefore most places that you go in Japan are going to look something like this. And from very ancient times, the Japanese developed a religious pattern where they believed that the Yama no Kami, the kami of the mountain, or the deity of the mountain, would descend into the fields in the springtime, bringing with it the life-giving waters that would make the field grow. And so the Yama no Kami becomes the Ta no Kami, the kami of the field. And at the end of the harvest season, they would collect up some of the best of the produce, and they would make a special offering to the kami in thanks for bringing all the bountiful harvest, and then send that kami back up into the mountain. So a couple things that are worth noting here is the priority of place. That this is a kami of a particular region, so it's a kami that protects that region. We call that a tutelary kami. So the idea is that the kami are tied to a particular place here, and that idea is going to be expanded when we think about the clans that develop as Japan becomes much more successful and is able to generate more resources. The clans grow bigger, they start fighting each other and growing larger as they expand their territory. And over time, that sense of a kami of place is changed a little bit, so that you get this idea of a clan deity, a tutelary kami of the clan, or an ujigami. And that idea becomes that the leaders of the powerful clans will claim descent from deities that are a little bit more expanded than just the local mountain kami that we saw in the previous example. And what I want to look at now is what this looks like for the case of the Imperial clan, the clan that provides the emperors throughout Japanese history. We have a single dynasty in Japan, and this is their story, and the story is very important because it has helped to ensure that Japan would have only a single lineage of rulers, despite the fact that most places you have, there are coups and people take over power. Well, in Japan, there are different groups that will actually hold power, but nobody ever will displace the emperor, and this is why. We have the origin myth from one of the earliest written texts in Japan, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, two different texts that are both in the 8th century that give some slightly different accounts, but together they make up what we know about the early mythology of Japan. And so in this story, you have Izanagi and Izanami, a brother, sister, husband, wife pair of deities, and as you can read here, that they perform a kind of ritual, and they essentially bring up this island from the ocean. And so we get the islands of Japan are created in this way. I want you to read that carefully and think about it, maybe think about how it relates to other creation stories, such as the ones in Genesis. The story goes on that they have some children, the most wonderful of which is Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and they are so pleased with how wonderful she is, shining and resplendent, and bringing life and light to the world, that they send her up into the heavens to rule. They also have a son named Susanoo, who's a storm god, and he's a bit more troublesome. In this particular story, he has done some terrible things to his sister. He climbed onto her roof and took a flayed horse And that's to say the skin has been peeled off of the horse and then thrown it down in there. Very terrible thing in Japanese tradition, because purity is very important, and blood is one of the most impure things. And so he does this terrible thing, and Amaterasu goes and hides in a cave as a result. And then we get this story where she's hiding in the cave, and of course that means that there's only darkness, and people have to figure out what to do. And so we have this wonderful story of all of these different deities, these kami, really a pantheon of deities that represent the ancestors and ancestresses of the various different clans. And they do a bunch of things to get her to come out. They put a tree here, a sakaki tree, which is still the sacred tree of Shinto, and they hang some special jewels, the magatama jewels. They hang these special jewels on the tree, and they hang a mirror on the tree, and they put it right in front of the cave entrance. And then one of them does this very lewd dance, essentially a striptease, and gets the crowd all going, and the crowd is all having a wonderful time and being loud and boisterous. And Amaterasu wants to know what's going on, and so she peeks out of the cave. She sees herself in the mirror, and she's never seen that sort of wonderful shining light, and she's drawn out of the mirror, and they seal up the cave with a straw rope called a shimanawa, and they say that she can't go back in, and so that straw rope has a certain kind of power. These elements that I just talked about in that story, they're all elements that figure prominently not only in the imperial mythology, but in the religious practices of Shinto as well, as we'll see. So here we see the three imperial regalia. We've got the mirror representing the sun, and of course this is supposed to be the mirror that was used in the story I just told, and the jewels. This is a sacred sword which is associated with Susanoo. Actually, what happened historically was that there were two different clans. There was the clan who traced its lineage back to the sun goddess, and there was another clan from a province called Izumo who traced their lineage back to Susanoo. And what we have, both historically and in a more symbolic version in the mythology, is that the Susanoo clan, they give the sword that is associated with their version of local kami worship, and they give that to the what will become the imperial family, because they've been kind of vying for power, and as the imperial family wins out, this is a sign of submission. And so what we're seeing in the mythology is a kind of reworking of actual historical events placed into a mythological context to help explain why certain groups are in power. But the Izumo clan is not completely wiped out, as often happens in these kinds of things, but rather they're allowed to maintain their authority over the region as long as they are submissive to the imperial clan. And so that's really what we're seeing going on in the mythology. It plays itself out by having Amaterasu, the sun goddess, bestow power onto her grandson, Ninigi, and giving him these imperial regalia and telling him to go and rule the earth, Japan, but expressed more universally. And then some battles are fought, and ultimately his grandson Jimmu becomes the first emperor, and that lineage goes right down to the present emperor and empress. And so Japan has this unbroken lineage, and that's kind of significant because although contemporary times are certainly, a lot has changed in the past couple thousand years, but the association of the imperial family with the Shinto tradition does remain strongly. It's certainly complicated by the end of World War II because Shinto played such a large role in focusing all power on the emperor and all the militarism that came out of that. And so Now in the Constitution, there's a greater separation of church and state than there was before. And yet, still one can say that in some sense the emperor presides over the Shinto tradition as a whole.